My grandfather had to come stay with us one weekend. I was only 11 years old at the time. He seemed to be trying to spend more time with us on a regular basis. Looking back, I now realize that was because he probably didn't think he thought he had very much time left. But it was at the very least the last visit that something strange happened. In fact, I'm still trying to piece it all together. I think I've pieced it together logically, but I haven't quite been able to accept it emotionally. It's too out there. I can tell something was wrong from the moment that I saw my grandfather when he came in the front door. He's usually all smiles, throws his arms wide, but that time he just kind of stood there, staring at me. He wouldn't open his arms. I opened mine and ran to him. That's when he opened his arms a little bit. I hugged him, and he felt very cold. Fall or autumn had just begun, and it was hardly colder than 50 degrees outside. When I looked up at him and smiled, he did make eye contact but refused to smile. Even my little brother was ecstatic to see him, and he was the most persistent in trying to get reactions out of him. Always has been. There was just something about the whole thing that didn't feel right. So I didn't hang around my grandfather any more than I had to, as much as it broke my heart to keep my distance. Nobody would say anything, but I felt like everybody else was kind of keeping the distance from him too. All except for my little brother, who was determined to find out where his love had gone. Long after his stay was over, this heaviness remained in the house. I felt empty inside, a compulsion to eat that I never had before. Sometimes it felt like the more I ate, the hungrier I became. My parents at the time chalking it up to a growth spurt, but it was even happening to my little brother, even worse, to the point that my parents were thinking of calling the ER since he could not get enough to eat. So, that was the weird part. I come home one afternoon to see that my brother wasn't home, and my parents looked as gray as the dead. They told me that my little brother was in a place that took care of children that were sick in the mind. I didn't understand what that meant, but when he was at school, he bit a chunk out of another child, and it took 3 adults to get him off. So they took him away where he couldn't hurt anybody. He was ill. This was some time ago, as I said. I'm an adult now. My brother has more or less disappeared off the face of the earth, and we have not been able to get any kind of explanation for it. The facility he was sent to would never disclose anything. Law enforcement refused to intervene, and they would not talk to us. And any time that we try to post about the situation we've ever put up over the years has disappeared. Hopefully this story, assuming you do read it, will be long enough for me to say that knowing what I know now, I'm sure that my grandfather had somehow been affected by what they call a Wendigo. I know it probably sounds like a stretch, but hear me out. My grandfather was found dead in his house about a week after he had visited us, and yet the report was that he had been dead for 3 weeks. Somehow that detail slipped past my parents and everybody else, and they too were affected by some sort of confusion that will not allow them to do the math and see the discrepancy. I even brought up the idea of saging the house, which everybody reacted very strongly to, in a bad way. If a Wendigo does exist, and was really involved in the whole situation, then they are much more dangerous and insidious than anything I could have ever conceived in my own mind. You're in trouble long before you ever see one with your own 2 eyes. I don't know why I did not end up like my brother. I only got a little bit of that cursed hunger, and that was enough to drive me crazy. It did go away in a couple of months, but it felt like years. My brother didn't have enough time for it to begin to taper off before he got in trouble, and now I have no idea how he ended up. Look, honestly, I have no idea if the system has him in custody for the sake of research or restraint, or if they began seeing him as a threat that needed to be neutralized, like he was some kind of rabid animal. Sometimes, I do hold on to the hope that I'll see my brother coming to visit me, and I'm not sure if that would be worse than finding out he's dead and at peace. I never actually believed in stuff that goes bump in the night. Not only did it seem too incredible to be possibly true, but it was far less frightening to not suppose they could exist. But they say seeing is believing, right? I still don't know for sure exactly what I saw. It scared me. I don't actually want to admit to myself what I think it was. So I'm telling you, hoping that you'll give me answers. You seem to give them to everybody else who writes into you. So, I'll start by explaining that I'm part of a research team for a university. The department that I work in specializes in historical findings in the United States. We were on a dig, where they had reportedly been on some findings, which looked like there could have been an entire village buried under the ground. You would think that that kind of thing would immediately equate to a big budget, and lots of people working, right? No. There were 2 of us. At that point, as is always the way, there was only me, as my colleague was back in the hotel. It was a very time-consuming project. We just didn't know what we might find. But the one thing that was certain was that we wanted to take our time and be respectful. We did it all by hand, with only the most necessary tools as to remove the topsoil. Once we got to the antiques, it was all slow time and hands-on with the utmost care. In typical fashion, I was there much later than I had planned and it was getting dark. We had some strong lights, although I just uncovered what looked to be ancient crockery, so I just lost track of time myself. I began to get so engrossed in what I was doing that I didn't notice this unusual smell. I was struck by this hideous odor. It isn't unusual when you are digging to find some earth, and to find some things like decomposing animals or carcasses, or other miscellaneous odors. I mean, you get the idea. In fact, I'm not even unaccustomed to pungent odors. But this was utterly repellent, and came out of virtually nowhere. I recall once accidentally hitting a raw sewage pipe. That was way worse, but not why I'm writing to you. I then heard my name being called out. I was alone, completely and entirely alone. The only person who could have possibly been there to know who I was my colleague, whom I had FaceTimed not 5 minutes before to say I was running late and to order me room service. He was very much in the hotel, which was a 15-minute drive away. So I sit there, hand over my nose from the stench over my mouth, so I don't scream. And then I saw this thing. The lighting that I was using pointed at the ground, so this creature was in the shadow, but its outline, which was the most horrifying thing, was fully illuminated. This thing was tall, skeletal, with limbs that were too long, and far too, dare I say, gangly to be human. The skin was pallid, and from what I could tell, it was naked and hairless. It looked diseased, as if flaps of skin were about to peel away at any moment, and all this led up to the head. It was skinless and bone, but no way appearing human. It looked deer, or maybe canid, something flat with an enlarged snout. The empty eye sockets had a low glow of red to them, and atop this skull had 2 oversized antlers that looked as though they should cause this creature to topple over, due to the sheer disproportionate size. I screamed, and I screamed. I may have never been so completely and utterly petrified. Whether that was enough to placate it, I don't know. But it just casually turned around, and within seconds was gone. I sat there, stuck to my spot, mouth agape and frozen, After a few moments, my colleague rang, asking what the hell was going on. I hauled myself into the truck and got out of there. I never told him or anybody else what had happened, but I can't stop thinking about it, and even shortly afterward, would have nightmares reoccurring over and over. And in fact, to this day, this thing still haunts me occasionally. So I feel like writing this out will do me much better than it will bad. When I was around 15, I had snuck out to see this boy that I had liked. This was far back in the early 90s. Much simpler times, and climbing out of your bedroom window to make out with a local bad boy, who ironically is now a cop, married with kids, and an all-around still nice guy, was exciting, but not exactly life-threatening. If my kids tried it today, I'd be calling the police in minutes. But anyway, yeah, simpler times. We met at the end of my driveway and snuck off to the woods, not far behind the house where we lived. It was during one of these illicit makeout sessions that we had our encounter with something, what I would call from the depths of hell. Oh, we were also both very into horror movies. His dad had the most amazing VHS collection, mostly 80s stuff. So at first, when we heard the crunching sound, like somebody coming up to us, he was all like, "Ooh, I hope it isn't Jason Voorhees." And I'm pretty sure at that moment, we thought it was just going to be a nosy raccoon or something. Then, all of a sudden, there was the worst stink I'd ever smelt. We both look at each other, and we both wonder what that was. He was all like, "It wasn't me. Even I can't make the smell. It must be a skunk." But it had this dead smell to it, like a skunk mixed with a cadaver. So you have this rustling noise, and now this awful smell. But the spell was soon broken, as out of the shadows of the trees appears this monstrosity that clearly was not a skunk. Thank the Lord it didn't get too close, as I might have just passed out. This was clearly a monster in the flesh, tall and skinny. Its arms and legs were all long and droopy, and its back was bent over. It had this revolting whitish skin, and I'm not talking like a person. It looked like dirty brown snow. And then its head was really messed up too. It was kind of like a skull, except all rotted and gross, and big, empty black eye sockets. I could hear it breathing, rasping. We all just ran. I didn't even give it a second. I didn't want him to leave, but I would have gotten into a whole lot of trouble if my dad found a boy in the house, so he went back too. I hardly even slept that night. We still saw each other for a while after that, but I refused to ever sneak out in the night again after that encounter. I went through a phase of camping and hiking alone. I was working an extremely stressful job with very long hours, and whenever I closed a case, I needed to blow off steam alone. Instead of hitting the bar or the gym, nature was my way of relaxing, and it usually worked pretty well. I'm also usually pretty intuitive and good at reading people and signs. Why I did not take heed of the warning that day, I'll never know. But one thing I am damn certain of was that I had a lucky escape. Sadly, someone else didn't. You see, I was camping out of ground that on one time or another used to belong to the natives. I had been informed that it was sold a long time ago, and that the owners had been very respectful. It had been wasteland, and they turned it into a bustling campground. All the original woodlands surrounding the campsite was left intact and not cut down. I never go to these places in high season, as it would go against me wanting to get away from people. I have nothing against families, and love seeing parents taking their kids out for fresh air and exercise. But I don't want to be surrounded by others. Hence why I was there right at the very end of the season, with just one other camper on site. For some reason, when I got to the site, the only member of staff left seemed incredibly nervous, and in hindsight, it seemed they were actually doing their utmost to convince me to turn around and leave. But as I said, I didn't or choose not to pick up on this. I hiked, made a fire, and went to bed. Didn't even see the dude in the other tent, which was exactly how I liked it. Sometime in the night, I was woken by the most awful noises, like screaming but not human. It didn't seem like the other camper, and also, not close enough to be somebody on the site. Since I had no way of protecting myself, I somehow managed to convince myself it was probably a coyote, as they can scream like a banshee. I'll admit, I was too afraid to call out or go looking. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself. But the noise got closer, and then I heard footsteps. Something literally brushed past the tent, and something big. It sounded like it was dragging something. There are bears and wolves and all sorts of things out here. They don't usually come anywhere near the camps, and at most would steal your food and run off. It must have been a bear. The other dude must have left some food out, and a big bear came and stole it. That was what I told myself over and over. Did bears scream like that? It stopped for a moment, right outside, and I almost wet myself. I had a small portable lantern, in which gave off just enough light that it wasn't exactly pitch black inside the tent, and just showed about the outline of the shadow of the creature outside. The bear. And it had to have been my imagination, but it appeared way too tall and thin to be a bear, and it seemed to have what looked to be antlers. This bear continued on its way, dragging what had to be leftover food it had found. Only that's the only thing that made sense. At some point, I must have fallen back into a deep sleep, and was awakened by the shouting and sirens of dogs. Turns out the member of staff had come to check on us, found the other dude's tent wide open, and blood everywhere. The drag and dirt markings led right to my tent, and past it. The police were called, and they asked me all sorts of questions, and I had to explain to them what I thought I saw, heard, and the shadows I'd seen. They all looked at one another, and I knew something really bad had happened. Of course, I had to give my DNA and be tested and questioned, but thank God they think that I had nothing to do with it. Scariest thing about the entire thing, they never found the other guy. Just more blood marks and drag marks, leading off into the woods. They even did a full-on search. They found nothing, and from what I was told, is that they searched for well over 30 miles. So, what took him? That's a question I'll always be asking.